There is the economic impact of the war in the Middle East, one of several wars, sadly, um, to consider. We have seen processors, so processors showed lower prices. Now they're gone for now. They've pulled back again. The 305, 320s is gone, but showing the lower prices and pulling them back has impacted the way buyers think about it. They think those prices might come back. And of course, the combination of all of these factors is a certain amount of a loss of buyers' confidence, despite a really good and positive 2025. On the other side, on the blue side, on the bull side, factors for higher prices. Well, first of all, higher costs. Raw cashew nuts are high priced at the moment. Freight costs are likely to rise, although, freight, at least for cashew kernels, is not a hugely impactful factor. Freight is a relatively low proportion of the overall price. But energy costs can have a big impact. So we have, I think, Andre, I think you've got a sound problem. If you could mute yourself, we're getting a big echo. Okay, back to business. Higher prices, lower crops in West Africa than originally hoped for, originally forecast, a steady demand trend following on from 2025. And again, some of these regulatory decisions causing confusion for buyers and probably impacting prices upward, or at least providing an argument for higher prices for many who are trying to sell export raw cashew nuts. And I think the regulatory decisions are far more impactful on raw cashew nuts than they are on cashew nut kernels. So the way I'm seeing it is the market relatively balanced, factors that might influence prices to fall, but equally factors that might influence prices to rise, balancing out the market for now, balancing out the market sentiment, which is important at this time of year, but we're still looking at disruption, mainly for political reasons. Let's have a look at some of the prices. So I thought we'd just do a comparison over the 3 years, 2024, 25, and 26, and we have a look at how prices compare over the 3 years. So you can see the bar charts. This is about West Africa. You can see the 7 countries listed at the bottom. The green bars are this year, current prices. Blue is last year and the red is the year before. Now, we're not going back to 2024 prices, that's clear. But where are the differences? So if we look at 2026 prices, the current offered prices, this is on offered prices. And I take offered prices because I can immediately judge what they are. I don't know the deals that are done, but I know what the offered prices are. On average, if we take everything to £48, so that means if it's £50, we reduce the price accordingly. If it's £46, we increase the price accordingly. Bringing it to an average of £48, this is what we get. And prices are about, on average, about $85 a ton higher this year than they were last year. That's an average figure. But that difference, that average, is mostly in 2 countries. It's mostly Benin and Ghana. Now, Benin shouldn't even be exporting, but Benin material is quoted in the international market via neighboring countries. And Ghana, which is a supplier, so Ghana supplies through Ghana. I'm often not sure how to say this, but about 420,000 tons flows through Ghana, including Ghana's own production. So Ghana has a high quality crop, but also handles a lot of material that's transit from Cote d'Ivoire, from Burkina, and elsewhere. Therefore, Ghana has a big influence, particularly for Indian buyers. So what we can see is that most of the price differences are in these 3 countries: Benin, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. We have to be careful with this because Benin is not officially an exporter. Burkina Faso is not exporting now and will not export until after the 1st of April at the earliest. So when you look at that and then you compare prices for Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, the price differences are quite moderate. So we're probably not seeing a market as firm as it might look if you take certain origins. The big differences on Benin and Ghana might also suggest that Indian buyers are more anxious than Vietnamese buyers because they are the favored origins because of their quality for the Indian market. Indian buyers will tend to pay higher prices for raw cashew nuts because they like to buy better quality material. So the market may not be as strong when Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau really come on stream for exports. That's the first factor. Let's have a look at cashew kernels. And again, so now we're looking at 2020 all the way through to the current prices in 2026. And we're looking at the high, the low, the annual average price, and the close of the year. These are monthly average prices. They're WW320s and they're FOB, the lowest priced origin, which is usually Vietnam. So when we look at the current price levels, what we see is relative stability over the course of the first quarter of 2026, and it pretty much matches the situation last year. We're not seeing a great deal of volatility in prices. People may have seen the high of the year, but it was very short-lived in 2025. We may have seen some low offers, but there was very little trade during that period. So relatively stable prices, very similar to last year, but higher than the starting prices of 2024 when we saw the market move up. So again, I think the main thing is that relatively stable cashew kernels prices support growth in demand. We've seen that last year. And in a normal situation, we would have expected exactly the same thing this year. We would have expected demand to pick up. We would have expected imports to the United States to recover and growth elsewhere. So we're seeing some volatility in raw cashew nut prices, although that may be an early season mismatch or a misleading situation, but we're seeing stability on cashew kernels prices. And that's persisted through the last couple of weeks. Maybe RCN spiked up a little bit, but generally speaking, prices have remained stable. If we try and bring those two things together, and look, this is not an easy thing to do because you've got to assume average costs of processing. You've got to look at only one or two grades because that's where there is transparency on pricing. But in general and broadly speaking, what we're seeing is that if we take three examples, so I've taken Indian raw cashew nuts, or Indian processing of Ghanaian raw cashew nuts, Vietnamese processing of Ivorian cashew nuts, and Indian processing of Ivorian cashew nuts. In all three cases, we see the red line, the international market for 320s, and the black line, that's the Indian domestic market for 320s. But in all three cases, the put together cost today for processors is higher than the market. That would tend to suggest that raw cashew nut prices are higher. It would also suggest that even for Indian processors in a protected market, that it is difficult to make the margin that you would expect to make from such a complex activity, such a risky activity as cashew importing and processing. So tight margins, that tends to indicate that the chances for lower prices on cashew kernels are limited unless the price of raw cashew nuts was to fall. And it would have to fall a long way before it would become really attractive. Now, this doesn't mean that processors will stop. It may mean they'll take their time. But what it does mean is that given the current situation, if you buy raw cashew nuts today at today's prices, the only way you can make money is that cashew kernels prices go higher. Now, is that realistic in the current environment? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. In the current economic scenario, is it realistic that cashew kernels prices would shoot up? And that's really the key to understanding this issue, or is it more realistic to think that raw cashew nut prices might slip back a little bit? Of course, if you've got an empty warehouse and you need to keep a factory running, you still need to buy. But what we're focusing on here is the situation where a processor planning for the season, not just for next week or next month. So we're looking at the mismatch. We're looking at a significant mismatch. Do cashew kernel prices and raw cashew nut prices ever match on a day? Well, actually, only very rarely do they match. Only very rarely could you buy raw cashew nuts today, sell the kernels that you'll produce today, and make a profit margin. But over time, it does tend to find its way. Let's look at production. I'm going to update you on some of the things. And as I said, the production situation is becoming a little bit clearer. I've been talking to friends in Cambodia, and we'll start there. High prices in Cambodia at the moment. If you take it out into US dollars, you're looking at prices over $1,800 a ton at the farm gate. You can see a nice picture there of people working on raw cashew nuts from the current crop. That's from our friends at Ample Agro, who gave us some input on the current situation in Cambodia this week. The first crop certainly was impacted by some unseasonable rains. That means that the first crop is a little bit lower, which may explain the high prices. The trading this year started somewhere between $1,300 and $1,400 at the farm gate. It has spiked up in the last couple of weeks. Buyers have been active. Does that mean a lower crop? Not really. The second harvest can change all of that, but we do expect a later harvest this year. We've seen good flowering. We do expect a longer crop, so we're going to have to keep watching Cambodia until May. Don't forget, in Cambodia, you got last year also later export. So you've got a couple of factors here to take into account. Firstly, the first crop is influenced by those rains, and that damaged some of the flowers initially. But it looks like the second flush is much better, similar to last year. That means a longer crop, but also let's not forget that trees are still maturing in Cambodia, so new production is coming online. So we're kind of looking at that, looking at the growing conditions, and we're thinking, okay, I've certainly marked back my expectations for Cambodia this year, but I think the crop will be above the 5-year average. I've put a low estimate in about 950,000 tons versus over a million, 1.02 million last year. But some people still say the crop can reach the same level as last year. So Cambodia could produce a million tons this year again, but it looks questionable, a little bit less likely, and we'll be keeping an eye on how that harvest goes over the next 2.5 months or so, as we're expecting a later close to the crop. But we need to keep bearing in mind in Cambodia that there are still trees that are young and they are coming to maturity, and their output is tending to increase. What about Vietnam? Well, all indications from Vietnam we saw discussed at the Vinacast meeting at the end of last week that the crop looks really good. Production is probably up a little bit. We also see that imports into Vietnam are up in January, February, up by 18%. That's significant at a slightly lower price than last year, about $100 a ton lower. That's about 7% lower than last year. We have seen Vietnamese buyers active in Cambodia, and we're beginning to see a start to their activity in West Africa too. But they're not in any rush from what I can gather. Processors are now holding their prices on kernels. They have marked them up a little bit and they're holding them. I think we could say that a little bit of composure has been regained amongst Vietnamese processors. Initially, they were pushing prices down, but there seems no reason to do that. Now, there is some 2025 crop available ex-warehouse in Ho Chi Minh City and elsewhere. So I don't think between the Cambodian crop, high imports in January and February, and a little bit of old crop left, that there's likely to be any too great a push. And I don't think Vietnamese processors, and this is my opinion, but I don't think the Vietnamese processors will be surprised by the extension to the growing or the purchasing period for processors in Cote d'Ivoire, or similar situation that might happen in Burkina Faso. I think people have learned their lesson and they now know how to read the signals. So good crop in Vietnam. The production in Vietnam is significant, obviously, for Vietnamese farmers and processors, but in the big picture, Vietnam imports 90% of its raw cashew nuts for processing. So the domestic crop, although it gives a positive start to the season, doesn't mean a huge amount in the big picture of world production. On the other hand, Cote d'Ivoire does mean a lot in the big picture. We've seen strong growth over the past few years that culminated in a record crop last year, more than 1.5 million tons, and that's probably a little bit lower this year. Now, we should bear in mind that comparisons with 2025 are risky because 2025 was an exceptional year. It was an exceptional year not only for 1.54 million tons of production, but also for cashew quality. It was always unlikely that 2025 would match, that 2026 would match 2025. That was always unlikely. So beware of comparisons saying quality is down on last year. It was raw cashew nuts because even by the end of May last year, when there were record imports in Vietnam, by the end of May last year, only 55,000 tons had been imported from Cote d'Ivoire. So I don't think this 10 days makes a huge difference. Raw farm gate prices seem to be holding. Now, not everyone pays the minimum price. Let's be clear about that. But for processors that follow the rules, prices are still 400, 425 at the farm gate. That's interesting because generally speaking, the quality is lower. So whether buyers are paying a little more for the better quality or whether this is the general price, well, that's working its way out. We're on the cusp now of the second harvest or the second flush in Cote d'Ivoire, and that may start to influence these prices. Generally speaking, volumes are pretty good. Quality is lower than last year. It remains to be seen if that is lower than the average over the longer term. I had a chat with some processors, and they all seem to be in a price range, $3.45 to $3.55. They're holding their prices on the main whole grades. They are making some sales. Buyers are prepared to pay those prices. Some buyers are committed to developing sourcing in West Africa. So in Cote d'Ivoire, these prices are holding for the moment. That's a significant premium even over the top shippers in Vietnam, which is something that's been there since around about April, May of 2022 and looks set to persist for a variety of reasons that we've discussed before. We are seeing some export buyers active, whether or not they should be is open to interpretation, but that also is supporting the market. Generally speaking, in Cote d'Ivoire, if you buy early, you get better quality, which would encourage activity even before the export window opens. So I think we've kind of marked back our expectations for this year in terms of the volume. The original forecast from the CCRK, the regulatory body, was 1.6 million tons. It doesn't look as if that's going to happen this year, but I think it could still be a better crop than 2024, and maybe a crop that would be even better than the 5-year average, but probably not a crop as big as last year. Whether or not that makes a major difference in the overall situation, well, we'll come to that in a little while. So moving on, and let's have a look at Nigeria. We haven't really looked at Nigeria so far in our first couple of webinars. And again, in Nigeria, it looks as if the crop is a little bit lower than last year.
Recording in progress.
Were very high, way too high for processors. I think there was a little bit of speculative activity, probably a little bit of dreaming, um, price-wise, but it looks to me as if trade is now beginning to flow. There are, of course, inflows from Benin. Prices at the farm gate and in the trade are easing a little bit. Nigeria is a big supplier to Vietnam, 175,000 tons imported by Vietnam last year. India took 83,000 tons, and that'll be helped by the increasing quality of Nigerian raw cashew nuts. The Ogbomosho material is obviously a premium product. Last year, we were looking at a crop more than 300,000 tons, possibly as high as 340,000 tons. I think that we're tending toward the lower end of the estimate, somewhere between 270, 280, that kind of a range. But there are still people who maintain that the crop will be 300,000 tons. General trend in Nigeria, pretty strong, as you can see on production, but this is distorted. It's distorted by the inflows of product from Benin since we saw the ban on exports from Benin. And that's further complicated this year by the other major outlet for Benin raw material, Togo, increasing its export tax. There's no export tax from Nigeria. Processing in Nigeria, there's good sized processing capacity, but it is largely underutilized. Vietnam remains the largest customer, mainly for Burma kernels. We saw Vinacast telling us again this week that imports of Burma kernels were more than 100,000 tons last year. Nigeria has, unlike many countries in West Africa, it has a huge potential in its domestic market. Level of urbanization, the number of people means that it is probably one country that could significantly consume cashew nuts, but that remains a trend for the future. One factor we should look at is the currency in Nigeria. So the Naira, the currency of Nigeria, fell significantly over the past year, lost about 15%. Nigeria is an oil exporter, so we have seen it pick up recently, but what we're likely to see is volatility. So the volatility in the currency will impact the export of raw cashew nuts particularly, and we are likely to see some ping pong back and forth in Nigeria as the currency becomes more volatile, and that is made even more difficult by the supply situation on petroleum given the war in the Middle East. Moving on to Burkina, another country that we visit this year virtually for the first time. Forecasts are optimistic. Some of the official forecasts are really optimistic, over 230,000 tons, which is hard to justify. Farm gate price, I believe, is unchanged around about 690 US dollars, 385 CFA. The trade has been reported, and this is interesting, that the trade at the farm gate has been much higher than that. People have mentioned to me prices around 550. That's caused major processors like Anatrans and Gabbana to think twice about paying those prices. But we will see an increase, I think, and I hope, in processing in Burkina this year, maybe up to 20,000 tons. There are some big numbers floating around for processing in Burkina Faso. I don't buy them. I don't think there was more than 50,000 tons processed last year. I stand to be corrected on that, but from what I see, that figure is not real, but I do think processing is increasing there. Raw cashew nut export is suspended in order to allow processors to buy until the 1st of April. I wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised if that were pushed out a little bit further at some point, particularly given the fact that prices are so high and processors are so reluctant. So there is a difficulty, and again, we talk about mismatches. And if we look at the figures for Indian imports, Vietnamese imports, and processing in Burkina Faso, and I've gone back to 2024 because it's easier, go back a year, skip a year, it's easier to get your numbers more accurately. but still the figures don't match. So either it's a net overestimate of production, which is possible, and I would say that this official figure of 230,000 tons is an overestimate, um, or we're seeing some smuggling, which is also possible. And let's not forget, when you have countries, and there are several examples of this in West Africa, when you have countries where one country has a high export tax, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina, or a ban in the case of Benin, and neighboring countries, Ghana, Nigeria, Togo up to this year, have low export taxes, you're bound to see some smuggling. That's the nature of business when you can't enforce borders and enforce regulations. So I think we have to be careful the way we look at production from Burkina Faso. It's definitely moving in the right direction, but we need a little bit more transparency on how that is happening. Speaking of transparency or lack of, let's have a look at Guinea-Bissau. And we're now seeing from Guinea-Bissau a lower official crop estimate. Crop estimates in Guinea-Bissau tend to be a little bit more accurate than elsewhere. This year now we're seeing estimates between 260 and 280,000 tons. Last year was certainly 300,000 tons. We can track that by trade. Um, that was an excellent crop. It looks like a good crop by the standards of the last 10 years, but probably not as big a crop as last year. If you recall, on the first webinar of this year, we flagged that there had been some unusual rainfall patterns in Guinea-Bissau early in the year, and that was an alarm signal for the harvest. That continues. It is very early. Let's not forget that it is early. The harvest has not started. It may get bigger. Looks to me as if we will see a crop in this range, 260 to 280. That's a good crop. We did see smuggling really back on the cards last year, and you can judge that. I mean, just looking at this, let me focus in on this map a little. If we look at the whole situation in this part of West Africa, you can see that there's smuggling from Guinea-Bissau into Senegal, into the Gambia, but also into the Republic of Guinea. In the past, there's been movement of product from Cote d'Ivoire illegally. That's largely stopped now. But certainly the trade there completely lacks transparency. So we have several routes to export. We now have an export tax introduced in Senegal, more on that later, but it is still far less than the taxation on exports in Guinea-Bissau. And in Guinea-Bissau, there is the other factor, and that is that the port of Bissau is not an easy one to deal with. Because it's not an easy one, apart from export taxes, there probably would be a tendency to send product through the ports of Banjul or in the Gambia or Dakar in Senegal. So Guinea-Bissau, early season, but prospects of a decent crop, maybe not as big as last year. Elsewhere in West Africa, so these are countries we have focused on closely earlier in earlier webinars. Let's have a quick look at Benin. Still a crop forecast about 10% better than last year. The export ban is in place. Trade has started. A lot of smuggling likely. I think that's going to continue. It's not making for an easy environment for anyone, particularly farmers in Benin, but the policy is not going to change. If we look at Togo, and Togo has become more of a focus because of that trade across the border from Benin, but also because production there has grown. It is difficult to estimate the production in Togo. It's anywhere between 25 and 45,000 tons, but what's grown in Togo and what's grown in neighboring countries and brought in is very difficult to discern. It is clear that the government has decided to increase its taxation policy. They have increased export taxes by 2.5 times and decreased the farm gate price. So again, if we talk about conflicting signals and mismatches, Togo is a pretty good example of that. So we see grow more, but we'll pay you less. And we see export more, but we'll tax you more. And this is going to be an interesting development. Processing in Togo is present, but not in any major volumes as yet. If we look at Ghana, definitely indications are that the second flush is better. Quality certainly not up to the expectations of a normal year. By the end of the season, we might find the crop is a little bit lower than expected, but I don't think that will be a big factor in the end. Lower quality for sure, but significant inflow from neighboring countries. And again, we have this lack of transparency. So things we know for sure are what was imported by India and Vietnam from Ghana and identified as Ghanaian origin. That's over 420,000 tons last year. We know pretty much what is processed in Ghana, and we know what people are saying to us. Add up all of those things, and it would definitely suggest a lower crop. But then again, I would never have subscribed to the estimate of the crop of 250,000 tons, which is spoken about by different agencies and sometimes by government agencies too. So whether or not it's genuine drop in the crop or whether it's just poor forecasting is quite another matter. Traders certainly have had the day. It's been a remarkable amount of chit chat about the Ghanaian crop. Does this make a big difference in the world supply? Probably not, but it certainly has an impact on buyers in India who like to buy Ghanaian raw cashew nuts. And they buy them for their quality, and it is an excellent quality product. Republic of Guinea seems to be a more stable situation in terms of the numbers. It looks like about a decent crop. Maybe conditions are not as good as they were early on, so maybe this 150,000 ton estimate is just fading a little bit. There are quality variations, that's noted, similar to other countries in West Africa. And smuggling, as I mentioned, has generally been controlled, so we can trust the trade figures to a greater extent than we might have done 2 or 3 years ago. And finally, finally, at least in this segment, on to Senegal. Crop, it seems okay. 55, 60,000 tons is about the size of the crop. Very interesting that there is now this processing bonus. Processing in Senegal is a very small activity, but there is a bonus now if you export cashew kernels. And this is 150 CFA per kilo, which is it's quite significant and is a support for processing. They've introduced an export tax on raw cashew nuts. So Senegal, in its own way, is following the trends of other countries in West Africa, without the production to match, of course, and without the processing to match. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes and the impact that that might have on the flow of material in from Guinea-Bissau. Generally speaking, I think there is, and I think it's fair to say that the quality in 2026 is lower than in 2025 across the region, perhaps with the exception of Nigeria, possibly with the exception of Benin too, but elsewhere it's certainly lower. But we need to bear in mind that the second crops or the second flush or the second wave, whatever we want to call it can look very different. So it can look better, it can look worse. So we need to keep a close eye on the weather conditions. My understanding is that generally speaking, volumes are holding up. So when I estimate West Africa this year, I think I'm happy enough with the basic statement that the crop will be lower. If I look at our pessimistic estimate, that would mean about 11% down across the region, and our optimistic projection about 1% down across the region. Where do we get this information? Well, we have a lot of conversations with a lot of people that ranges from processors to government agencies to traders. We, of course, pick up every little bit of published information. We put it all together. We have certain regions where we would use as benchmarks, if you like. We have certain people that we would use as reliable benchmarks to put together these estimates. Accuracy wise, well, if the trend, we have been relatively accurate in recent years, but I can't say that on any given year because we don't know what the weather conditions will be. But on what we know now, this is quite a wide range from a minus 11% on the pessimistic to a minus 1% on the optimistic. Both are minus, by the way. But even the pessimistic estimate is pretty similar to 2023, which was by no means a bad crop. 2.8 in 2023, 2.71 in 2026, estimated on the low side. One factor we probably need to consider, and these are raw cashew nut figures, so it doesn't consider that, but if we were to get a lower yield right across the region, that would reduce the output of kernels from these raw cashew nut tons, I think by somewhere between 2 and 4%. Just something to bear in mind. That's not a figure that will have any impact on this market until we get to the very end of the season. My gut instinct tells me that the forecast is more likely, in volume terms, to get bigger than smaller. I think we have a relatively pessimistic estimate at this stage. I think that might improve, but I'm not saying it's going to be bigger, but I'm going to be closely watching the signals. So all in all, focus on West Africa at the moment says lower crop, not hugely lower, not significant enough to make a major difference in supply and demand over the course of the year, but certainly a lower quality crop in the major producers. What does that mean for world production? Well, if we take particularly Cambodia, I haven't mentioned India today, but we're going to get to that. Indian figures are a little bit slower to come out. We'll wait and see on India for a couple of weeks and then we'll talk about that. If we take all of these factors, West Africa, what we've already seen in East Africa, Cambodia and Vietnam, on the pessimistic side, it looks like about minus 6%, but on the optimistic side, about 4% up. I think we're more likely to see the pessimistic. And again, to put this into perspective, if we look at even the pessimistic estimate for this year, that would still be the largest crop in history, excluding 2025. So we need to be very careful when we look at markets and we think simply just comparing to last year. If we were comparing to a bad year, we'd be saying this is a huge crop and production is through the roof. If we were comparing to a bumper crop of like we are in 2025, we might be tempted to say that this is a poor crop. It's not a poor crop. It's a big crop, but quality-wise, it's average. And in terms of its volume, it's on trend, just not as good as last year. That's what we know now. Looking at Cambodia, over the next couple of weeks, particularly Côte d'Ivoire, and then focusing on India, that'll show us which one of these estimates is about right. So if we look at the production outlook, as we look in March 2026, crop is likely to be less than last year, but still a decent crop. Côte d'Ivoire is the biggest influence in West Africa. Lower quality adds this extra question of outturn yield. Cambodia may produce 1 million tons, but that's becoming less and less likely, and the crop is also going to be later. Vietnam and India likely to produce average to good crops. Vietnam's crop looks pretty good. India's crop so far okay, but it is probably too early to reach any major conclusions on India. Longer term, now let's stand back from 2026 versus 2025 versus 2024. Longer term, the trends indicate continued fast growth. So we are going to see more and more cashews produced. There are trees planted that haven't yet yielded. There are trees planted that haven't reached maturity in Southeast Asia, in West Africa, and particularly in East Africa. And we may even see in the coming years that in India, with government support, that there will be an increase in production there too. Shorter term policy tinkering, as I call it. When I say what I mean by tinkering is when someone has a reasonable policy in place, they have it operational, but they can't resist the temptation to react to market conditions. Market conditions in the case of cashews are often simply rumors. Governments react, and it remains a difficult situation to read, and we get unusual decisions that really aren't in harmony with the market conditions. So we need to keep an eye out for that. If we, if I would give one piece of comment on this, I'd say it's especially important now to beware of rumor and myth. Look at some of the AI generated stuff on LinkedIn at the moment. It's really poor, it's really inaccurate, and it's really misleading. So if you're not sure, check the data, be very careful what you believe. Um, it's simply a way, we have a poor information system in the cashew business. I think everyone would agree with that. Into that poor information system, two things happen. Some people, like African Cashew Alliance and the sponsors of this webinar, try to address it. They try to publish information and improve the situation. There are plenty of other organizations doing similar things, but others try to take advantage. And the taking advantage in February and March, when the raw cashew nuts come to the market, is often a major risk factor for processors. So be careful of that. Let's have a look then at the consumption side, demand and the kernels trade. And I suppose, first of all, we need to look at the political situation, and not so much the situation itself, but the impact of war. So, first of all, basic conclusion, if we look at 2025, about 9% of world demand was in the region that's directly impacted by the war. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Secondly, we have to remember that oil and gas prices impact everything. It's not only freight, it's not only transportation, it's manufacturing, it's gas impacts, particularly gas impacts the cost of producing roasted nuts. Most cashew nuts are consumed in that format in Europe or the United States. It also impacts consumer prices and demand. So the temptation is to focus on something basic like the cost of freight, the cost of shipping and disruptions to it. But in actual fact, the impact on demand is probably a greater impact than the impact on basic costs. So inflation in markets, economic disruption, these are all key factors that can impact demand. And two of our key markets, India, the long-term and the largest market, and China, the new and fast-growing market, both of these markets may be most affected by disruptions to supply. Both are dependent on imported oil, much of which comes from the Gulf and the areas impacted by the war. So despite strategic stockpiles and other mechanisms used by governments to manage the situation, there is a risk that consumer confidence turns down. And what that means is that consumers will be more careful, they will be more focused on essentials, and particularly in Western countries or in China, cashews are definitely not on the essentials list. They may be in India. And I would say, and without being alarmist, and we are not in this situation yet, and hopefully we will not be, but if we think back to July, December 2022, 2022 was the year when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw a real downturn in demand, especially in the West. And that was down to higher costs and inflation. And the war started in February, but the downturn in demand became evident in the second half of the year. So that's something just to bear in mind. So this political volatility and the impact of war is likely to have an impact on demand for our products and is likely to show itself a little bit later in the year. The big factor is how long does this war continue? And that, of course, None of us know. I'd like to just have a look then at the markets directly affected. Now, I've picked the wider region. Here we have the Gulf, the famous Straits of Hormuz here. And so what we see is that there are significant consumers in this region, but most of the countries are relatively modest consumers compared to India or China, for example. But add them all up, and you do reach a significant volume. In the greater region, the directly affected region is about 9% of world demand. If you take the greater region, that goes up to about 11.5%. I show some of the countries here. The demand which is lost during Ramadan is likely not to come back. Festival demand, once the festival is gone, is gone. That's one key factor. Second key factor is that the United Arab Emirates is an important redistribution and trading point for trade into a lot of countries across the region. Turkey is also an important destination and distribution point for countries across the region. Demand in this area is likely to be impacted by the conditions, that the economic impact, the political impact, and the human impact on people of war is going to impact business. Of course, just to say that the impact on business is a very small factor compared to the impact on the people who live in those countries that have been victims of war. Other factor which has been noticeable is the volatility of the US dollar. So the US dollar had been weakening, and if you look at the two charts, these are drawn from xe.com, a source we use for foreign exchange information. If we look at the trend, we see that the US dollar declining over a long period. Over the past year, the US dollar has been a little bit more volatile, but in recent weeks, it has shown some strength. And if we try to draw some basic conclusions on this, so if you take, again, we're looking at WW320s, we're looking at FOB, we're looking at the period January 2024 through to Monday of this week. You can see where the market picked up in price April, May 2024, and it's been relatively stable since then. I've taken the euro as an example. The red line is the US dollar price, the blue line is the euro price, and you can just see that in the last 3 or 4 weeks, after the little drop in prices in Vietnam, prices picked up again, but they picked up more in euros, and that would also go for currencies of any other country against the US dollar. We've seen that you get a little pickup in prices, and the benefits of the weak dollar for buyers in euro have now turned into a little bit sour. Now, sometimes when things go against buyers, they tend to enter the market. They see that change is possible, they see that volatility is possible, and they enter the market. So this could, in fact, be a stimulus for buyers. But over the longer term, it will increase prices in supermarkets. So we've looked at the impact of the war in the region. We've looked at generally the impact of the war on inflation. We've looked at the impact of the war on currencies and prices as a result. I thought it might be a good idea to have a look at some of the other tree nuts. We only occasionally do this, but where are other tree nuts positioned? And the two key for me, when we look at cashews, I think it's important to look at almonds, even more important to look at pistachio. If we look at almonds, we see very similar consumption patterns to cashews. Europe, significant import market, India too, and China. But if we look at the US market, we see that domestic shipments of almonds are down 18% over this season. The almond season runs from September to August. They're 18% down. That's a significant signal on demand for tree nuts in the United States. Export is also down, but not as much. Demand for almonds is likely to be impacted by the war in the Gulf area because the Middle East and North Africa have a 25% share of US imports. The US by the way, in case you're not aware, produces about 80% of the world's almonds. There are inventories weighing on the market. So on the one hand, you have uh, a poorer domestic consumption in the United States, which might be a warning for cashews. On the other side, you have during the critical flowering period, or the bloom as they call it in the US, in February, there was mixed weather. So this caused prices to spike. So now we have this push and pull factors. It does seem likely that there will be more almonds looking for homes in the market, and they will be in competition to cashew nuts over the coming months. If you look at pistachio, and again, pistachio production is quite concentrated. The US is the leading producer, again, in California, just like the almonds. But the second and third leading producers are Turkey and Iran. So we have a significant impact on the supply of pistachios, possibly the longer the war continues. So pistachios have been making remarkable progress in recent years, growing faster even than cashews. US exports are up 24%, and to Europe, US exports are up by 29%. This is remarkable performance. But again, the Middle East and North Africa markets account for about 20% of US exports. So again, we see possibly more pistachio looking for alternative markets that could affect in competition with cashews. On the other hand, again, poor weather or unclear weather, let's say, in California in recent weeks causes a question mark over the coming production. So here we have a situation where you're getting, again, a kind of a push-pull situation. If there's an impact on pistachio production, it may help to sustain demand in cashews, but it looks like for almonds that there will be more competition. My guess is that pistachio are much likely to be more significant in impacting demand. So I don't think there's any clear signal here that there will be a major impact on demand for cashew nuts coming from other tree nuts, but it's very clear that there could be. And the longer the situation persists, particularly the difficulty in the Middle Eastern market, or if there were to be a major impact on demand for almonds or pistachio in India, you could see a situation where generally tree nuts start to press on the market, and that impacts cashew prices. Now, to say that they are directly related is probably stretching the situation a little bit, but I do think that we need to be aware of what's happening in other tree nuts. So we're going to come back to that in the coming webinars as the situation develops week by week. So let's try and summarize this situation as it stands. We saw a fairly slow start to the year on demand, but that has now turned to a concern as to the impact of perhaps increased inflation, loss of buyer confidence, impact on consumers of higher energy prices. That may have now turned to a worry on the overall demand. We have seen supermarket prices lower, particularly in Europe. We have seen stable prices throughout 2025. Both of those factors will have encouraged retailers and will have encouraged demand for cashew nut kernels, but we're now seeing that turn into a slightly worried situation. So if business has been done, the worry is less. But there's probably a bigger open position, more buying to be done this March than in previous Marches, and that's going to be an influence on the sector. Key factor. The key factor is how long the war lasts. You will probably have heard that from many sources about many aspects of this war, and that applies to our business too. Worry, I think, is that the fast-growing markets, so we're talking about China, we're talking about India, these fast-growing, excuse me, these fast-growing markets are the most exposed to the economic risk of the war. So if we think about 2025, a downturn on imports to the United States for various reasons that we have discussed before, an upturn in China. China sustained demand growth last year. What if that's not there this year? We were expecting a slower rate of growth in China in 2026. What does this situation now do for that? So we need to watch China, we need to watch India, particularly in terms of demand. And into that, let's say, worrying situation on demand, we're looking at a crop that's not as big as was hoped for. But there's no reaction to that so far. There's no hint of any kernels buyers chasing the market because they think the crop is less than expected. There's no hint of processors in any way aggressively buying because they see the crop as a little bit lower. So overall demand outlook. Buyers, I think, may want to slow down their buying. India demand is critical. It is strong, but it is exposed to the economic impacts of the war, especially higher oil prices. The price resistance level, which was around $3.305 FOB for the export market, is still there. But processors have marked up their offers, generally speaking, so we're seeing a less business than we might have expected. Will buyers mark up their prices? Well, a lot of factors need to come into play. The cost factors, how they impact demand, how supermarkets offtake continues, how much the demand in the Middle East has been damaged by the situation and will continue to be damaged by the situation, whether or not a perception that the US dollar could get stronger could bring buyers in, or whether that will have any impact or not. And then, of course, the lower open position indicating less volatility. What do I mean by that? I mean by the more cashews that are traded, when prices rise, there's defaults, delays, and that leads to a second and often a third wave of buying. Often people buying the contracts they originally bought, but at higher prices. That's probably not as great a factor today as it might have been in other years, particularly if we go back to 2024 and before that. And the question remains, how severe will the impact of the war be, or the economic impact of the war, and how long will it last? And just, reading various correspondence, this is a factor in all markets. If we look at markets for oil, obviously, but also for fertilizer, gases, ingredients, and so on. How long will this war last? And that's a key factor. We cannot say that despite really strong demand last year that we are going to be immune from the impact of high energy prices and the economic downturn that might bring. But we probably can say that if that turns out to be a mild impact, then cashew demand will be sustained pretty strong this year. So overall outlook, I think higher freight, higher energy costs, that's pretty clear. I don't think that there's enough of a change or an impact on production to cause prices to be much lower. I don't think there's enough of a change in production to cause prices to be much higher either. Lower quality is certain. That has an impact. That increases costs. China, I think, will continue to grow, but more slowly. Buyers, well, they've every reason to delay decisions right now. They've every reason to take their time with those decisions, and I think they will do so. I think, meantime, we really have to acknowledge that raw cashew nuts almost always out of line with the kernel's prices, but right now, too far out of line for business to take place. So either kernels need to rise or raw cashew nuts needs to get a little bit more real on price. Time will tell. My guess is that raw cashew nut prices will slip a little bit. And we've talked about policy and tinkering, changing the policy mid-season. It's still a risk, but as the weeks go on, that risk diminishes. And I think that some regulators have seen that some of their activities have not been positive, and I'm hoping that they will absolutely follow the market, absolutely do the right things for their own countries, but also consider the realities of the market and where that market is on any given day. So there's a quick run through how we are seeing things at the moment. Thanks very much for listening. I'm going to pass you back to Ernest to see if there's any comments or questions. Ernest.
Hey, thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. As always, a very good exposition of the industry. And we have learned a lot today. There is one question from Rohit, and it's a combo, indeed, a combo of questions. So let me just read it. As currently, RCN prices are not workable as current prices of white kernels. So how long this situation will go on? So how long will this situation go on? Or will we see soon RCN prices come to lower levels, or we can see higher prices of white kernel, which is very unlikely to happen? What do you make of the combo of questions here?
Yeah, I think it's probably right to say that because of the current situation, it's less likely that cashew kernels prices will rise. Probably, if we look at the big picture over time, it would be fair to say that cashew kernels prices are a little bit undervalued at the moment. More so from Vietnam than from West Africa, but that they are a little bit undervalued. Um, but it's hard to see how that will change in the short term given the current situation. The conclusion, therefore, must be that raw cashew nut prices will drift down a little bit. The gap between the buyers and the sellers, the gap between the offered prices and the buyer's interest at the moment is quite wide. Um, Vietnamese buyers, for the time being, have time on their side. They won't be in any rush, I don't think, during the month of March. Pretty healthy imports into Vietnam, a good crop in Cambodia. Indian buyers, again, I think Indian buyers have significant imports. They were active in Tanzania. Tanzania had another good crop. Mozambique also had a decent crop. So the supply hanging over into 2026 was fine, I think. But probably Indian buyers have a little bit less time. So my guess is that higher quality raw cashew nuts are more likely to keep their values. Lower quality raw cashew nuts are more likely to fall in value. I don't think kernels prices, on what we know today, I don't think kernels prices are likely to move up, but nor do I think that they're likely to move down. Cost factors are limiting that. Demand remains quite good. What we're talking about when we talk about the impact, the economic impact of energy prices, the economic impact possibly of inflation, we're talking about over the coming months. It's not going to be today or tomorrow. And judging that is quite difficult. So I'd be cautious about kernels demand for the second half of 2026. That remains to be seen. If oil prices were to come down in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we might see no impact at all. But if they were to last 3 to 6 weeks, then we may well see an impact on demand. So I'm thinking raw cashew nut prices to ease rather than kernels to move up. Um, I'm thinking also that just to add to that another dimension, and that is that West African cashew kernels probably keep their value very well because it offers an alternative to the long supply chain. And when we get disruption, the long supply chain from Vietnam becomes more risky naturally.
Hey,
Ernest.
thank you very much, Jim. Remember, the next ACA conference is between 22nd and 25th of September this year in Accra, Ghana. And please, you can ask your questions using the Q&A chat box or Q&A box or chat box. And Jim, I have two questions in the chat box. One is asking, do you think that Vietnamese buyers will wait till the second crop in Cambodia, that is in May, before they start buying in West Africa? So more or less what will happen in the west of West Africa given the Cambodia crop?
No, I think Vietnamese buyers will become active as soon as they see some clarity. I think that they obviously they need to buy. I think Vietnamese buyers are already looking, but I think that they're not likely to chase the prices.
Mm.
So I think they'll take their time on buying. The second crop in Cambodia is not in May. It's coming in. It's beginning to come in now, but it will be a long crop, is what I've been saying. It will stretch out into May. So we need to keep an eye on what's happening in the sector. Cambodia is a it's progressing very well. So you are now beginning to see new factors in Cambodia, such as the uh, drying locally as opposed to drying in Vietnam. You're seeing some Vietnamese processors engage in the market in Cambodia, and that is affecting the trend in trade. I don't think Vietnamese buyers could wait till May. They will need product before that. I mean, if you buy it today, you might expect delivery in May. If you waited till May, you wouldn't be looking until July. So I think probably April, first half of April would be a time when Vietnamese buyers would buy if they haven't already bought by then.
Okay, so back to the war in the Middle East and the impact on the sector. The next questioner is asking, with RCN exports from West Africa currently limited and the geopolitical tensions impacting kernel demand, how do you see this supply-demand imbalance affecting cashew prices in the short to medium term?
In the short term, not at all. Short term, I think we'll see relatively stable kernels prices. In terms of raw cashew nuts, logic would say raw cashew nut prices should slip back a little bit. There's more supply at this time of year, so naturally would expect prices to drift down a little bit. I don't think that the current raw cashew nut market has factored in the impact of the war on demand. This year, broadly speaking, so we're looking at key markets. If we think about the overall supply and demand balance, first of all, I think the impact would be seen in the second half of the year. The level of impact depends on how long the war goes on. And overall, it seems unlikely to me that we will see a huge surplus emerging this year, but we may see slower movement of products. So I think that what may happen is that some of the lower quality material gets left behind in West Africa, for example. I think that the trade in Burma kernels might be a little bit less this year. And I think that, in fact, I'm hoping that we see price stability because that will, once the situation becomes clear, that will stimulate further growth in demand. And that's what we need. We need further growth in demand because we're seeing strong growth in production. So I'm not, although I'm concerned about demand, particularly in Western countries, um, in the short term, in the longer term, and I mean longer term this year, in the second half of the year, I'm concerned about China and India if the war goes on a longer time. I don't think we're going to see a major surplus emerge, but we could see a situation in the last quarter of the year where possibly prices come under pressure and raw cashew nuts that are left don't find as easy a market as we would have expected them to find.
Thank you, Jim. The next GME is on the 1st of April, next month. And we would like to know what we should expect between now and the 1st of April, particularly also what will be the outlook for places like Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and Gambia as they head to the start of their season years.
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, the three countries that you've mentioned tend to produce a high quality cashew nut. And I think there will be demand for those products if they're well priced. If they're attractive, Indian buyers will act. What might be more problematic is lower quality products. So, yields, the 46 pound material that may be seen in some countries in West Africa will find it more difficult to find a market than 50, 51 or better material that might be seen in the countries that are further west Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Gambia. Um, but I would say that if I look at it, if I look at farm gate prices generally across West Africa, whereas I think they were all too high, to be perfectly frank about it. I think they were set too high for the market conditions going back to mid-February. But certainly now, mid-March, they are too high. And I think that is a significant struggle. So you have a real tension in the market now. You have quite high farm gate prices, although they're lower than last year. You have very high export taxation. You have buyers reluctant and a lack of clarity on demand. Those tensions mean that it is going to be challenging to market raw cashew nuts this year. I think what it's going to do, unfortunately, is probably encourage more informal cross-border trade in West Africa. And I think that's something that governments in Guinea-Bissau, for example, are concerned about, and rightly so. I think it's something that the regulator in Cote d'Ivoire is concerned about, and indeed rightly so there too. Um, I would say maintain the quality, ask a reasonable price, move the product because the risks are greater now than they have been even a month ago. If we see a situation where the war concludes in the next 2 weeks, for example, then I think it's back to business as normal and you look at probably a positive outcome for the year. But I still think raw cashew nut prices that are spoken about in the market are too high. And I don't think that's healthy. And I think what it's going to do is it's going to mean that buyers will delay. And if you delay buying in West Africa, it usually means that quality declines even further. So you can't really delay when you don't have infrastructure. You can't support prices that are too high when you don't have infrastructure. So really, unfortunately, this year, I think the circumstances show that we need a more flexible approach to setting farm gate prices so as to allow quality exceptions and market exceptions to be taken into account in the course of the year. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about markets and cashew policy in 2026.
Thank you so much, Jim. And so we come your way again in next 2 weeks, 1st of April. It is thank you all for joining us, and bye-bye to all of you. And Jim, see you again.
See you, Ernest. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully see you all the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.